Hi, everybody. Good evening.
There's 36 people on.
Great. So welcome. We have a strong number of folks here in our Beit Midrash, and a strong number of people who are joining us on Zoom. And welcome to the folks on Zoom. Really glad that you can be with us. One of the things we've learned since the pandemic is the miracle of technology allows people to come together, and really excited to be with you this evening. So there's a statement in the Gemara, Kol Yisrael Aravim Zebazeh, that all Jews are responsible for one another. At Betham, we, I think, do an excellent job in many different areas, but among them, that lean into the ways, just ask folks at home if you would mute yourself if you are, and we'll have a Q&A later in the session, give a chance to unmute.
Please mute yourself. I keep muting you and you keep unmuting. Please keep yourself muted.
All right. So, Betham, as you know, is not just interested in the Jewish story, but also the ways that our particular Jewish values radiate out into the world. A universal expression of our particular Jewish values is the way that we frame it. And we had a good example of how we do that in last week's Parsha, in Afrimot Regime, where we had the famous line where we describe that we should love our neighbor as ourselves. Which could be understood in more political terms, but at Betham, we really think about that as loving our neighbors. This notion of all Jews being responsible for one another, undergirds what we do in the world, right? It's hard to be responsible for our neighbors writ large if we don't have a good sense of who we are as well. So tonight, we're going to hear from a journalist, I'll introduce in a moment, who will speak about two areas of concern to the Jewish community that certainly are impacted by the world beyond, and are impacted by Jews in the world beyond, but we're going to focus a little bit on the Jewish story. The first year or so. And we'll also make sure that we leave time at the end to field questions, for Sam to field questions. So the mic off. Oh, back there. Okay. So we'll use the mic for Q&A later. Can you hear me all right at home if I just talk like that? Give me a thumbs up. Excellent. Thank you, David. Much better. David's always working, even when he's no longer executive director. Thank you, David. Appreciate that. So also, we'll have a chance for Sam to speak about the situation in Israel, the judicial reform, if I want to give it more of a neutral term, which I'm inclined not to, and other concerns and interests that we might have about the state. So let me say a word about our speaker. Samuel Sokol has a background in reporting both in Israel and in the Jewish diaspora. He's a reporter for Haaretz, previously correspondent at the Jerusalem Post, has reported for the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, the Israel Broadcasting Authority, and the Times of Israel as topics. His reporting covers various topics relating to the Jewish experience, including religious, political, military, and social issues. He's the author of Putin's Hybrid War and the Jews. I will also add, just on a personal note, he is my cousin. And it's such a delight to welcome you to our congregation in your capacity as a professional grown-up and not, as I remember, Sammy from Shabbos Dinner. So, welcome, Sam Silver. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here. And while the topic that I'm here to discuss is not as pleasant, I'm very happy to be here to discuss it. If Rabbi Berg, you, Cousin Dan. So, as Berg so kindly mentioned, I've been spending about the last decade working on the issue of Ukrainian Jewry. Now, at the beginning of 2022, when the Russians invaded Ukraine, Vladimir Putin made a very strange statement. He explained that he was invading his neighbor to complete the denazification of Ukraine. Now, many people in the West found this rather perplexing. One, Ukraine is not a Nazi state, and two, we really didn't know where this is coming from. But for those of us in the press who have been covering Ukraine for the past since the beginning of the conflict, this really wasn't very surprising. It was a new terminology for a leitmotif in Russian propaganda that's been really, really consistent for years.
Sam, I'm just going to interrupt. Folks at home, you're not hearing? Raise your hand if you can hear Sam speaking. No, not hearing. Okay. Can you hear me? You hear me okay?
We can hear you, but not all that well. We can't hear him at all.
No, can't hear. It goes in and out and it's not clear at all. Yes, no.
We can't hear either.
Lainey, you need to mute yourself.
You are muted.
You know how to do that?
Yeah, wait a minute.
So we can hear Rabbi Berg better than the speaker. And for those who are at home, if anybody is unmuted, it affects the sound. So everybody who's at home really has to make sure they're muted.
Sam, why don't you let's have you use the microphone, because I don't understand. Folks, we're going to use the microphone. My apologies, Sam. You just one more time, because I want this on. Yeah. Okay, hi. So we're going to have you use this. And we're just going to ask everybody at home to mute themselves, okay? You got that? If you don't, we're going to have to mute you. So keep yourselves on mute. Can you hear me okay at home now? Is that better?
Can't hear you at all. Can't
Okay,
hear
I'm
you.
sorry.
Yeah, Lonnie, you have to mute
Lainey-
yourself.
Lainey
I
is
am.
not muted, and that's one of the problems. Oh, now she is. Okay, good.
Fred is not muted.
All right, I'm going to ask everybody to mute themselves at home, and I'm going to ask those whose video are on, if you could give me a thumbs up if you can hear me speaking now. Okay, great. So folks, we're going to have to, if you're having trouble hearing, it's because your speakers are too low at this point. So at home, you're going to have to raise your speaker volume if you're having trouble hearing me, okay? All right, because it seems like now the sound is going through. All right, Sam, take it away.
All right, thank you. Okay, everybody can hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, so to backtrack a little bit for people at home, when the Russians invaded Ukraine in the beginning of 2022, Vladimir Putin said a very strange statement to Western ears. He said that his military action was necessary to complete the denazification of Ukraine. Now, many people in the West had no idea what was going on because, one, nobody really was looking at Ukraine as a Nazi state, and two, where did this come from? It seemed very random. And for those of us who've been covering this story since the beginning of that conflict in late 2013, early 2014, you know, this really sort of made sense because this was just a new term applied to a leitmotif in Russian propaganda that has been really consistent since the beginning of the Russo-Ukrainian conflict. And that is Russia's use of fabricated anti-Semitism to tarnish the Ukrainians and to delegitimize the Ukrainians. Now, there are legitimate issues with Holocaust memory and anti-Semitism in Ukraine, and we're going to get to that. We are not here to whitewash anything. And the fact that there are issues in Ukraine do not detract from the fact that the Ukrainians are the victims in this war and are on the right side. And while as a journalist I'm not really supposed to have public opinions on issues, I think it's pretty clear to most people who the aggressor is in these circumstances. But going back to the beginning of the conflict and why this was something that became a defining feature of the conflict, you have to remember that a large part of the culture of national memory, a large part of how Russians identify themselves, especially under Putin, though this goes back to the Soviet period, is the cult of the Great Patriotic War, the cult of the Second World War, the victory over fascism. It forms a core part of contemporary Russians' identity in a way it just doesn't for people in the West. For people in the West, the Second World War is mostly history. For people in Russia, it is a defining characteristic of who they are as a people. So nobody in Russia cares about the Jews. It's not relevant. But they care about Nazis. And if you can make your opponents look like they are Nazis, then you have gone a long way to rallying public support behind yourself in whatever action you choose to take. So let's step back a minute. In 2012, before the Ukrainian Revolution, which we're going to get to, a far-right party called Svoboda, or Freedom, was making inroads in Ukraine. It had gone from a marginal party with almost no representation to taking a significant minority of the parliament. I believe it was somewhere around 9% of parliament, but I'm blanking on the figure, but around there. It was becoming a rising force in Ukrainian politics. And this was worrying, very worrying the local community, because this was a deeply anti-Semitic, white supremacist party with connections to fascist ideologies. And I don't mean fascist in a pejorative sense, I mean fascist in a literal sense in this case. And the Jewish community was very worried. So when, in the end of 2013, Ukrainians took to the streets to demonstrate for the ouster of their pro-Russian president, who was deeply, deeply corrupt and violent, many in the Jewish community were worried because members of Svoboda were very prominent in the protests. The protesters, in their hundreds of thousands, took over central Kiev in an area around the Maidan, which is the central square of the city, in a protest that came to be known as the Euromaidan. They were fighting for the ouster of the president and greater European integration. And the problem was fighting on the barricades, literal barricades. They made barricades out of snow and ice. I was there during the revolution. I saw people using metal poles to break up ice on the sidewalks to fill sandbags. There was some serious conflict going on, and one of the groups that was really active in the fighting, pushing back against riot police and hired government thugs, were members of Svoboda. And at the same time, there were a string of violent anti-Semitic attacks against Jews in the Kiev neighborhood of Podil. Think the Eastern European version of Williamsburg. It's a neighborhood filled with hipsters and Hasidim. Now, this was something that was very out of the ordinary because in Eastern and Central Europe, violent anti-Semitism is relatively rare. Now, you'll have, in the public discourse in this part of the world, anti-Semitism is much more tolerated. People can make anti-Semitic and racist statements, and they're not going to face the same type of pushback they would in Western Europe or in the United States. But by the same token, actual physical violence is much more rare than it is in, let's say, Paris or London. So I would be very nervous to put on a kippah in London. In Kiev, I wouldn't care. So you started to see these attacks against Jews. And there were two schools of thought. There were people who thought that anti-Semitic elements were using the revolution and were emboldened by the revolution to attack local Jewish communities. And there were community leaders, some very prominent Jewish community leaders, who thought that pro-Russian forces were staging provocations to make the protesters look bad. To this day, we don't really know what was happening, but we know during the protests there was rising anti-Semitism. I personally witnessed swastikas scrawled on walls in Kiev during the revolution. So people were nervous. And at the time I was working for the Jerusalem Post, and I had been to Ukraine a couple times before covering stories related to the Jewish community. So when they picked someone to go, they said, okay, Sokol, you, Ukraine, war, violence, go, enjoy. And so I ended up covering the Euromaidan for the paper, and I thought that there was a specific narrative structure that things would be following. I thought it would really be similar to other stories I had covered in other countries, because this was a period of rising European anti-Semitism. We saw far-right parties like Jobbik in Hungary and Golden Dawn in Greece, and the rise of Marie Le Pen's faction in France. So it looked like the story of Svoboda was going to be along the same lines. And that narrative continued for a while, because after the revolution, the protesters formed an interim government. 3 members of the new cabinet were basically neo-Nazis. They were members of Svoboda, and Jews were worried. And it was at this point that Putin, having lost control, his levers of control in Ukraine through the president, tried to reassert control. He sent in unmarked troops into the Crimean Peninsula, and he started to foment a Russian-backed insurrection in the eastern border region of Ukraine, bordering Russia, called the Donbass, which is made up of 2 areas, the Donetsk and the Lugansk oblasts, or provinces. Now, the thing is that part of the justification that he gave during a long rambling speech was the necessity to use military action to prevent a rampage of reactionary and anti-Semitic forces. He justified his behavior by saying he had to defend Russian speakers and Jews. Now, the local Jewish community didn't want to have anything to do with it. Their basic response was, yeah, leave us out of it, guy. No, we've had enough in this part of the world. But this was Putin's basic justification. Now, there was a certain amount of truth that he was, building his propaganda on. The best propaganda is always based on a kernel of truth, but he was not above helping things along. So the first day that the unmarked Russian troops, who were nicknamed by the Ukrainians the Little Green Men, started fanning out throughout Crimea, the rabbi of the local Reform synagogue got a call from the president of his community, and he told him, come to the synagogue, come right now, it's an emergency. This rabbi, Misha Kapustin, shows up at the synagogue. He sees anti-Semitic graffiti on the doors. Now, the rabbi's very, very, very suspicious. One, because it's the logo of an anti-Semitic group that does not have a presence in Crimea. It's active in other parts of Ukraine, especially western Ukraine, but not in Crimea. And 2, the logo was drawn backwards. Now, if you put two and two together, we don't know for sure, but we're pretty certain that this was a Russian provocation. And the rabbi decides, to hell with this, I don't want to live under the Russians. His father had been a Soviet military officer, he grew up under the Soviet Union, he knew what it was like to live under Russian control, he didn't want it. So he came out very publicly against Russia and announced that he was against the Russian occupation, he was against annexation, and he's going to leave. So the rabbi starts preparing himself to leave, and he gets a call from Russia Today, the Russian government propaganda network. And they say, look, we'd like to do a segment about you leaving. And for some reason, I don't know why, and I never got a satisfactory explanation out of him, he agreed. So RT sends a team. They actually happened to send a correspondent based in Tel Aviv, and she does this whole segment, and when it airs, they cut it in such a way as to make it look like the rabbi was saying, not I'm leaving because I don't want to live under Russia, but I'm leaving because I'm scared of Ukrainian nationalists. They edited it in such a way as to change it. And I remember the rabbi telling me afterwards, I felt like I needed a psychologist and a stiff drink. And so this sort of set the pattern. Now what undercut this and changed the narrative that we all thought there would be. It's always important, one, to understand the framework of what you're reporting facts in, you report a fact, it has to be a framework. You have to understand the larger picture. But when that picture proves to be incorrect, you have to be able to change the narrative framing and say, this is not actually what's happening, something else is happening. So the framing that we thought we were working under broke apart when, after the interim government arranged elections, the Svoboda party went from, a significant force in Ukrainian politics to having one seat in the Verkhovna Rada, the Ukrainian parliament. Out of more than 400 lawmakers, there was only one Svoboda lawmaker left. And this sort of undercut the idea that Ukraine was moving in this ultra-nationalist, anti-Semitic direction. My personal feeling is that the anti-Russian patriotic messages that they were promoting had been co-opted by more moderate and significantly less racist parties, and that undercut support. But there were also allegations that the pro-Russian government had built up Svoboda to pose sort of a political threat, to be able to point to them, to their voters, to say, no, vote for us because you don't want these guys. But whatever it was, suddenly you have a government that's significantly less anti-Semitic than the Russians are portraying it. And that doesn't stop the Russians. So over the course of the next couple of years, we see a steady barrage of propaganda in official Russian media, essentially accusing the Ukrainians of every single type of anti-Semitic crime imaginable. Now, there was actually an increase in anti-Semitic vandalism following the revolution. Who was responsible and whether it was provocations or local anti-Semites, it's unclear. They don't call me up when they're gonna do something and say, yeah, just by the way, here's my, social security number and my address, here's who I am. But the general rule is the situation in Ukraine is always less rosy than the Ukrainians paint it, and much, much better than the Russians do. So a great example of this was I was in Jerusalem and someone says, hey, did you see that there was a pogrom in Odessa? I go, what are you talking about, a pogrom in Odessa? Sends me a link to an article in Izvestia stating that members of this far-right group, Pravi sector, were beating Jews across Odessa. I go, this doesn't sound right. In fact, this group was a hard-right nationalist group, which was trying so hard to shed its nationalist image that it had actually been collaborating with Jewish communities to paint over anti-Semitic graffiti. And they were trying very hard, bending over backwards to appear to be philo-Semites. So something sounded wrong. That this is against their entire interest here. So I call up the head of a Jewish institution in Odessa that I know, and I go, hey, what's the deal? Yo, is there a pogrom? What's happening here? And he covers the phone. I overhear him speaking to someone else. They laugh. He comes back on the phone. He goes, nah, any pogroms in Jerusalem? A little bit later, they had a segment on Russian television where they claimed to have a copy of a letter sent by a prominent rabbi in Brussels to the World Jewish Congress, begging for the World Jewish Congress to intervene in Ukraine to save the Jewish community, which, if anybody knows anything about the World Jewish Congress, they do a lot of very interesting and good work, but they're not exactly, the elders of Zion. They can't just come swoop in and, okay, we're gonna change governments. But, this is real life. So this was very interesting, because this letter said, oh, they're shutting down Jewish newspapers, they're shutting down Jewish schools, there's no organized Jewish communal life. Which, one, I checked in local communities, this wasn't happening. Two, I called the rabbi. And I go, did you write this? He goes, no, they just photoshopped it. And so on this went. Now, the problem is that the Ukrainians were giving the Russians really good ammunition for their propaganda. Because while the Ukrainians were not, by any stretch of the imagination, doing anything that can be construed as state-sponsored anti-Semitism in terms of specifically calling out the Jewish community, they were engaged in a pastime which has become increasingly common in the region since the fall of the Soviet Union, which is the creation of new national myths, a new useful national history to differentiate themselves from the Russians and to separate from the Russian historiography that had been imposed on them during the Soviet period. So what that means practically, short of all the jargon, is that they needed new national heroes, they needed new national myths. This is happening in Poland, in Lithuania, in Hungary, in Russia itself. And often, this involves rehabilitating people who fought against Russia, military figures, nationalists, people who were involved in the formation of a national identity. And the problem is, who was involved in fighting against the Russians 70 years ago, 80 years ago? Nazi collaborators. So the Ukrainians dug back into history and picked up on Stepan Bandera. Bandera was the leader of a group called the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and known more popularly as the UN. Now the UN was a fascist organization, again, not pejorative, literally fascist. They believed in the the Führer principle and in racial hierarchies and in purity of blood and all of this nonsense. And they collaborated with the Nazis. The UN and its military offshoot, known as the UPA, were responsible during the war, the ethnic cleansing of, depending on which historians you ask, up to 100,000 ethnic Poles and thousands of Jews. Its members, both as part of its own formations and as volunteers in German police divisions, were responsible for genocide. And it was an extremely racist organization. Now, the Ukrainians go, okay, we need new heroes. UN and UPA, they fought against the Russians. Great, we're gonna lionize them, but we're gonna elide all of the anti-Semitism and the genocide, and we're gonna pretend that didn't happen. We're gonna repackage them as national heroes who believed in a multi-ethnic Ukraine, who believed in democracy and progressivism and human rights. So you start seeing them fabricating stories of Jews serving in UPA. You start to see this entire new national mythos emerging. In fact, in 2015, they passed a bundle of laws known collectively as the decommunization laws, which mandated that these groups are national heroes and it's illegal to denigrate them. Now, was this anti-Semitic in intent? For the most part, no. There were political actors who were doing this out of anti-Semitic intent. For the most part, though, it wasn't. Was it anti-Semitic in practice? Very much so. And the Russians picked up on this, and they have been picking up on this for a decade now. I think this was last week, the Russian Foreign Ministry released a human rights report for Ukraine detailing all of this. They very much ignored their own human rights violations in Ukraine, but they detailed this. Now, the problem was that if you asked a Ukrainian Jew anytime over the past decade, are you worried about this? They would say yes, but they would say, but we're not scared of it. Well, if you would ask them, what are you scared of? They would go Russia, because the Russian aggression did more to harm the Jewish community in Ukraine than anything else. While acting ostensibly to save the Jewish community, Russian forces destroyed Jewish communities across eastern Ukraine. So in 2014, shortly after the occupation started, I went into Donetsk, the capital of the separatist republic, the Donetsk People's Republic. They founded two People's Republics in eastern Ukraine, which they later acknowledged as independent states and then just went on to annex. And I was in Donetsk, and I go up to the local rabbi, and he's under a great deal of pressure because the war is right on his border. There's intense fighting going on at the Donetsk International Airport, right outside the city. Bombs are falling, and members of his community are trying to get out any way they can. And I remember him telling me, as long as there's one Jew in this city, I am not going anywhere. Well, he sends his wife and kids abroad. He starts working almost 24 hours a day to get his congregants out. And at the end, he's left alone, traumatized and scared in his house with the bombs falling. And he still decides, I'm not leaving. It wasn't until a member of his community called him up and said, listen, my wife just gave birth. I'm not giving the baby a bris until you're physically there, so get your tuchus out of there. That the rabbi goes, all right, I'm getting out. And you hear stories like this across the region. The Jewish community in Lugansk had their synagogue raided by separatists who were looking for weapons because of rumors that Igor Kolomoisky, a Ukrainian oligarch and a Jewish Ukrainian oligarch who had been tasked with controlling the government-controlled areas next to the rebel areas, had been funneling them weapons. Now this is a very interesting little tidbit that sort of undermines the Russian narrative of Ukrainian fascism. In the beginning of the fighting, the Ukrainians didn't really have an effective army. They didn't have the proper weapons, they didn't have the proper training, they were deeply corrupt. So what did they have? They had volunteer militias. And you had volunteer militias like the Azov Battalion, which was explicitly neo-Nazi. And you had many, which has always been problematic. Most of their people were either killed or captured during the fighting in the Azovstal plant in Mariupol, which we'll get to later. But you also had other battalions which were controlled by Kolomoisky. What you essentially had for a couple of years there in eastern Ukraine was a Jewish warlord controlling his own private army. I actually went on patrol with his troops in the village of Chermalik. It was, I mean, you've never seen a Jewish warlord in Eastern Europe before. It was something completely new. Actually, if you go to the Western Wall, when you go to the left and there's the area under the arch where there's the inside prayer area, you'll see, you actually see plaques to Kolomoisky, who donated money to help build it. Well, he helped build the Kotel. He also helped build Jewish-funded militias. But the fighting got so intense that thousands and thousands of Jews in eastern Ukraine were displaced. And in fact, between 2014 and 2018, more than 30,000 people made Aliyah from Ukraine to escape the fighting. I interviewed, probably at this point, hundreds of Ukrainian Jews. And one question I would always ask is, both to people who were internally displaced and people who fled the country, why did you leave? And were you scared of anti-Semitism? And I have literally never heard one person, one Ukrainian Jew say, I left because of anti-Semitism. It was always, I left because of the war. I left because my home was destroyed. I left because the economy collapsed because of the war. It was always the Russians. It was never the Ukrainians. Now, that's sometimes hard for us to accept because the Ukrainians have a very, very bad reputation from back during the war and from before that. In fact, my great uncle, when he heard I was writing a book that was sympathetic to the Ukrainians and critical of Russia, told me that the Russians had saved our family during the Holocaust, and if he ever had the opportunity, he would rip my manuscript to shreds. Obviously, I never let him see it before it was published. But the problem here is that this type of Russian propaganda really did have an effect for a while, but even outside of Russia. Now, with everything the Russians are doing, we see, people are much more skeptical of the messages coming out of Kiev, out of Moscow, but really, they did a very good job of trying to portray the Ukrainians as anti-Semites. Now, aside from the issue of national memory, which was problematic, you also had the fact that you had groups like the Azov Battalion and other right-wing groups which had come to prominence during the fighting, and the government had a hard time weaning themselves off of dependence on groups that were willing to fight the Russians and had experienced troops. And you actually did see an increase in crimes against certain minorities. So, for instance, members of far-right militias that had ties to the interior minister were involved in attacks on the LGBT community, on Roma encampments. I have a friend who's a foreign correspondent who was beaten pretty badly while covering an LGBT march in Kiev. But for the most part, these were things that passed. And what we saw was Ukraine becoming increasingly liberal and democratic. There's still a lot of problems there, don't get me wrong, but they have been really on an upward trajectory. And I remember I made trip after trip interviewing refugees, speaking to people there, and seeing how they were rebuilding their lives. And one thing that I saw in 2020, right before the pandemic shut down international travel, I flew to Kiev and I met with the rabbi of Donetsk. He had rebuilt a synagogue in Kiev beautiful 3-story building, Jewish community center, indoor playground, the offices of his own personal kashrus brand, synagogue, etc. And I saw people there who I had interviewed repeatedly over the years and was able to track the progress of people, how they were rebuilding their lives, rebuilding their communities. He had built a synagogue for internally displaced Jews from Crimea and from the Donbass. Now, this only lasted 2 years, because in the beginning of 2022, when the Russians came in and it looked like they were about to take Kiev, the rabbi fled. He took hundreds of people from his community, organized a convoy, got the hell out of Dodge. And so you have, for the second time in a decade, an entire community uprooted. And you have to remember, these communities in Ukraine went through pogroms. They went through the Russian Revolution and Civil War. They went through the Holocaust. They went through communism, and they had their numbers decimated when the Soviet Union collapsed, and you suddenly had, hundreds of thousands, millions of Russian-speaking Jews leaving the region and coming to Israel and the United States. So this was a real rump of a community. They didn't have anything in the way of Jewish religious activity, Jewish cultural activity, Jewish literary activity. They had to build everything from scratch. And then to see that, after 30 years of hard work, gone because of the Russians who, basically coming and saying, never mind that we're shooting you, we're here to save you. Well, that's essentially what happened. Now, the war had basically become a frozen conflict. A lot of people were saying, oh, it's gonna end up, like other frozen conflicts where the Russians have taken control of territory, like in Georgia or Moldova. But in the beginning of 2022, that changed. And I always when I think about this and what happened here in 2022 till now, I always think of it from the perspective of the rabbi in Mariupol. Mariupol was a town that had been taken by the separatists at the beginning of the conflict. It had been liberated. The Jewish community was able to maintain its cohesion, and it was never a really pretty or pleasant city. I honestly never really liked it that much as a city, but it had a wonderful Jewish community. I davened in the shul there a couple times. I got an Iyar there, and it's a very pleasant rabbi. Now this rabbi, like many rabbis in Ukraine, was Israeli, and people before the invasion really didn't believe that the Russians were going to invade. Many people thought it was posturing. And so this rabbi had to go back to Israel for a medical procedure. He goes, I don't think they're going to invade, but in case they do, I'm taking my family with me so we don't get separated. And then when it's over, we'll all go back together after my procedure. But while he's recovering, the Russians invade. He spends the next 6 months watching from afar, fielding telephone calls every day from members of his community, screaming that loved ones had died, that their houses were destroyed, asking him to basically get them out. And he spent months trying to evacuate his people. And one thing that really sticks with me is I get a call from him one day. Now, I spent so much time there, I still haven't picked up Russian. I usually speak either English or Hebrew there, because I'm dealing with the Jewish community, so I always find someone who speaks Hebrew, who can translate, and I have Russian-speaking colleagues and Ukrainian-speaking colleagues who help me find information and translate things. So I get a call from him, speak to this woman. I go, what's the story? He goes, no time, call this woman, call her now. I call her up, she's from Mariupol, and she's been living in Israel for several years. And we spoke in Hebrew enough for me to establish that she had recently gone to rescue her parents from Mariupol, sneaking through the siege into Mariupol and getting her parents out. Now, I interview her, and she gives me like the short version, and then says, now that you know the story, ask me your questions in Hebrew, I'll answer in Russian. And I end up with this recording. So I call up a colleague of mine in Haaretz, who is a Russian speaker, and I go, listen, I need some help transcribing the interview. I was wondering if you could do me a favor. She goes, I can't right now, I'm standing in a mass grave. She was actually in Bucha, examining the mass graves in Bucha outside Kiev. If you're not familiar, Bucha is a suburb of Kiev that had been taken and occupied by the Russians, and when the Russians were pushed back, They discovered hundreds of civilians who had been brutally executed. Well, the next day she called me back and she goes, can you send me the file? I sent it to her. She gets back to me after she finishes transcribing. She goes, this is the most disturbing thing I've ever heard. I go, what do you mean this is the most disturbing? You were just in a mass grave yesterday. This can't be that disturbing. She goes, this is twisted. So she sent me her transcript, and essentially what this woman said was she went with her Israeli husband. They flew to Poland. You can't fly into Ukraine anymore. You have to go through Poland or Moldova. And she goes, hitchhikes with her husband across Ukraine from one end to the other. They sneak in through the blockade. They get to her apartment, her parents' apartment. Her father had died the day before, and they had moved his body into a storeroom to make sure that the animals could get at it. And they took her elderly mother, and I would not have believed it if she hadn't actually sent me video. They took her elderly mother, put her in a shopping cart, and her Israeli husband was pushing this elderly babushka through Mariupol in a shopping cart while holding a shopping bag that he had put her stuff into. It was a shopping bag he had brought from Israel, from the supermarket chain Yochanan. So he's standing there with a babushka in a cart with a shopping bag from Israel, walking past bombed out buildings, and they somehow managed to get her out and get her to Poland, and from Poland to Israel. And this was devastating to see this, what people are going through. Another person I know there, a reporter for a paper in Kiev, was telling me that every single place he had ever lived had been bombed. He had grown up in the Donbass. The village he grew up in had been destroyed. He went to the University of Mariupol. Mariupol is pretty much a bombed out right by this point. The synagogue is gone. The whole city is gone. He had just signed a contract to purchase an apartment in Bucha right before the invasion. And, it's just been devastation. Now, over the past year, what we've seen is the Russians have done the most damage to the groups they're claiming they want to help. Now, in Ukraine, if you go to Western Ukraine, they mostly speak Ukrainian. This is a bit of a simplification, but they speak Ukrainian in Western Ukraine. They speak more Russian in Eastern Ukraine. Well, who are the people who are getting bombed the most? They're bombing Kharkiv, they bomb Mariupol. It's the Russian speakers. And, well, as for the Jews, the Russians have bombed the Holocaust Memorial Site at Iyar. They destroyed the Hillel House in Kharkiv. The local synagogue got shrapnel through the windows. One Jew was killed by a rocket outside the synagogue in Mariupol, which was itself destroyed. And this has been a pattern we've seen over and over again. We're here to save you. Stop fetching if we kill you in the process. Now, where is Israel in all this, you might ask? Because that's where things get a little complicated. Because the Israelis have made it a priority, because of national security reasons, to maintain freedom of action in Syria. What's the connection? The Russians have a military presence with air defense systems and jets in Syria. And they have their interests in Syria, and their interests and Israel's interests are complementary. Israel, I don't know for how much longer, because during the course of the war, Russia's grown much closer to Iran, but the Russians have allowed Israel free rein to attack Iranian targets in Syria. And Israel is loath to endanger that. So Israel has refrained from taking sides in the conflict. This has been controversial. A majority of Israelis support helping Ukraine without military aid, but there are many outspoken people who are against that. I interviewed Natan Sharansky last year, who blasted what he called the government's moral cowardice in not fighting against what's happening there. But Israel has been very conservative in its approach, trying to be as neutral as possible. And that's led Israel to, in many cases, sort of ignore attacks on the Jewish community and ignore damage to the Jewish community. It's only been when there's been statements made by people on both sides of the conflict that involve Holocaust memory, for instance, or express anti-Semitism that Israel's gotten involved. So, for instance, Israel feuded with President Zelensky of Ukraine when Zelensky compared what was happening in his country to the Holocaust. Now, there are genocide scholars who believe that what's happening in Ukraine could rise to the level under international law of genocide, but it's not the Holocaust by any means whatsoever. But you saw then Prime Minister Naftali Bennett pushing back against the Ukrainians. By the same token, when Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, went on Italian television and said, you know, Zelensky is a Nazi, Israel pushed back against that. Here's the thing, Zelensky is essentially what you would get in the United States if Larry David became president. The Jewish comedian suddenly finding himself, president of a country. Now the funny thing is, before he became president, he actually was most famous. I won't say he was only famous from, he had a very big career before that, but he was most famous for playing a history teacher who accidentally becomes president in a sitcom called Servant of the People, which was the name he gave to his party when he ran. Now, Zelensky's a Jew, but Lavrov said, no, it's a Nazi government, it's a Nazi state, and Zelensky's a Nazi. So he's asked by the journalist, what do you mean Zelensky's a Nazi? The guy's a Jew, for God's sake. He goes, you know the worst anti-Semites are Jews, right? He goes, what? Yeah, even Hitler had Jewish blood. I don't think so. So Israel pushed back, and to justify itself, the Russian Foreign Ministry put out a little white paper in Russian and English explaining, here's Jewish experts and activists explaining that we're right. Now, they quoted a Holocaust scholar at Tel Aviv University, a Jewish activist in Kiev, and the Israeli Diaspora Ministry. And I went, well, this is weird because I know all the people they're quoting. The activist was someone I've known for over a decade. The academic was a frequent source of mine. And the ministry report, well, I was good friends at that point with the spokesman for the ministry because he used to be a colleague of mine at the Post. So I go to each of them, I go, did you speak to the Russians? No. What do you think of what they said? Well, they took us completely out of context, which is basically par for the course with the Russians at this point. Nobody is going to the Russians for expertise on Holocaust memory or anti-Semitism. In fact, Russian media has explicitly used anti-Semitic tropes to demonize opponents of the war. There have been cases where people have been dismissed as Jews for being against the war. There was one incident where a Jewish journalist had a pig's head put against his door after he spoke out against the war with the word Judensau in German written on it. And we have actually seen one senior official in Russia declare that they have to defeat the Satanists and pagans in Ukraine. He wrote in an article, and he said, as an example of the types of cults that have supposedly taken over Ukraine, he listed Chabad. Now, one can, make an argument that maybe the Mashiachist aspects of Chabad are problematic. It's not a pagan cult. Especially my wife happens to be Chabad, so I'm going to reiterate, it is not. I do not want to sleep on the Iyar when I get home. But that was so bad that the country's chief rabbi was Chabad and is close to Putin, actively called for this official to be sanctioned by the Russian leadership to have some sort of punishment. Now, that brings us to where things stand today. Over the past year, we've actually seen more Jews fleeing from Russia than from Ukraine. People don't want to be drafted into the army. People are scared of the direction that things are going in their country. Israel's seen a massive influx of Russian Jews. One of them is Pinchas Goldschmidt. He was the non-Chabad rabbi of Moscow and the head of the Conference of European Rabbis. I happen to know him both as someone I reported for and as the father-in-law of a former editor of mine. And he left because he was being pressured to publicly support the war. I wrote an article last year. I spoke to one community leader who said that he was threatened with the closure of his institution if he didn't back the war. No Jewish institutions have been closed, although the Russian government has tried to take legal steps to close down this Jewish agency. But I like your ringer.
Sorry.
Okay, all good. So we have seen a massive exodus of Russian-speaking Jews. At the same time, though, we actually saw last year, at least temporarily, a massive influx of Hasidic Jews to Ukraine. I'm talking about the annual pilgrimage to Uman, to the grave of Rabbi Nachman of Breslov. Every year, tens of thousands of Hasidim go to celebrate Rosh Hashanah there. Not me, but last year I went. I'm one of the only Orthodox reporters at Haaretz, and I'm the only Orthodox reporter they have with extensive experience in Ukraine. So they go, hey, do you want to go to Rosh Hashanah in Uman? On my own, never, but for a story, yes. So I ended up going to Uman. Tens of thousands of people, despite the war. Now, on the first day of the war, a rocket hit Uman, killed a woman riding her bicycle. But since then, there had not been, to that point, any attacks on Uman. So during the entire time I was there over Rosh Hashanah, every time the air raid sirens would go off, the local Ukrainians would shrug and go, eh. The Hasidim would just keep dancing and singing. Nobody cared. Last week, was earlier this week actually, losing track of time here, we actually saw in recent days a rocket attack that did hit Uman, killed more than 20 people, including multiple children. And that's something we've been seeing a lot of, is Russian terror bombing of Ukrainian cities. And they're using Iranian drones to do this, which has prompted the Ukrainians to essentially say, listen, your enemies are on the side of the Russians, come in on our side. We haven't seen that happen yet. The Israelis are currently negotiating over the provision of anti-drone systems to the Ukrainians. I have diplomatic sources who told me, which this wasn't my story that I broke. Barak Ravin and Axios broke this, but I have my own sources who confirmed everything after, that 2 Israeli defense firms are currently in talks with Kiev for the provision of anti-drone systems, defensive systems, but Israel's still sort of trying to remain out of it. Sort of the feeling is people will come here, we're providing a sanctuary for Ukrainian Jews, Russian Jews, well, let's not get involved. Obviously, many people find that problematic. And that brings us to where we are today. Where are we today? We're at the point where the Ukrainians are expected to launch much anticipated counteroffensive. They're hoping they can push the Russians back, at least enough to get further Western aid. And it leaves us wondering what's going to happen. What's going to be left? Even in Donetsk, which has been decimated, there's still a small rump community of Jews. And I think there's still going to be a Jewish community in Ukraine, but the question is how many and how viable. And that really remains a question. And I think it's really, at this point, up to the Ukrainians to win, because there's no other way that this is going to end in a way that Jewish communities can really rebuild. Because if the Russians win, I don't think there's going to be many Jews who stay behind. What I think I'd like to do now is open it up to questions.
In 2012, before the invasion, what was the size of the Jewish community in Ukraine and where were they?
Okay, so you hit on a very controversial topic.
So before you answer, let me just, if I may, and that's a good question. So really grateful for the presentation. Let's just take a moment to acknowledge Sam covered a lot of ground. And I know that there's interest here both in continuing to talk about the situation in Ukraine and also perhaps in talking about the situation in Israel. Sam wears multiple hats as a journalist at Haaretz. So if folks want to stick around and ask questions, you are most welcome. I know we have a number of people who are joining us on Zoom as well. If you have a question on Zoom, maybe you can use the chat, not the raise the hand function, the chat function. So if you would chat with Alex and let him know the question, Alex will raise his hand and we'll make sure we get questions to Sam. And Sam, since I'll I'll try to pass a mic around here so people can use the mic when they ask their questions. So with that, I'll let you answer Carla's question, and then we'll take additional questions.
So you were asking about how many Jews there were. Now, that comes down to how you define Jews and who you ask. So there's a few answers. First of all, if you ask the Jewish Agency, and they're going by the law of return, before the war started in 2014, they would have told you 200,000 Jews. If you asked Chabad, they would have given you the same number or greater, because Chabad always, in Ukraine, sort of has always exaggerated the number of Jews. If you ask demographers, you'll get a different answer. The general person I go after for numbers is a guy named Sergio Delbergula. He's an Israeli-Italian demographer at Hebrew U. He's basically the gold standard for Jewish demography. Now, according to Delbergula, before the war started in 2014, the core Jewish population, meaning people who identified as Jews by religion, people who were actively or identifying as Jews, was about 70,000. After all these years of war, at the eve of the invasion in 2022, that number, according to Delbergula, was down to 40,000. Now, Jewish identity in the former Soviet Union is always very difficult, because you have people who are Jewish who don't identify as Jewish, people who, whose only connection is several generations ago, who never, don't meet the halachic definition from any denomination, but who are actively parts of communities and are considered, important parts of communities. So it's always complicated, and you have Jews who are Jews who don't know they're Jews. A great story is I was at a Jewish Agency event in Kiev, and there was a teenager at this event, and he participated in these Jewish community activities. He was saying, I really want to make Aliyah to Israel, but first I have to convert. I'm not halakhically Jewish. And one of the Jewish Agency people goes, what do you mean? And he goes, well, my mother's Jewish, but only my mother. And they're like, you realize that, according to literally every single denomination, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, you are considered by everybody to be halakhically Jewish. And he goes, I am? He didn't know that he was what he was. So to ask, who is a Jew, it doesn't just get down to the argument between Jews of how we define a Jew, but it gets down to the fact that people aren't at the stage where they can be part of that argument because they don't even know what the argument's about. So who's a Jew in the Soviet Union? You got me.
Okay, let's do more questions. I'll bring a mic over so folks can hear the question. Yes, John.
So now that Putin's been indicted, if that's the right legal term, by the International Criminal Court, do you think that's going to strengthen his position to the extent that it needs to be strengthened in Russia?
I think that it's definitely going to reinforce his determination to hold on to power, and I think it's good internally for propaganda. I think it's important that the international community makes sure that there are consequences for war crimes. Whether or not that's going to have a practical, immediate effect, I don't think so, but I think it signals that things are being taken seriously. And I think that sometimes, things that are just rhetoric can really be important. So, yeah, I think it's an important move.
Yes, Elegant.
What will be his initial judicial proposal, the public proposal, when the Knesset comes back into session? And what will his proposal be a month later?
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. That's a good question. Thank you. So who here is following what's happening in Israel regarding, okay, a very, very well-informed crowd. I like that. So I'm still going to sort of summarize for those who don't know. Essentially, the current government is trying to pull the teeth of the High Court of Justice in Israel to say, you need a supermajority of 12 justices to overturn the law. And if you do that, we can take the bare majority in the Knesset of 61 out of 120 lawmakers to overturn your decision to invalidate a law. Now, the thing is, and this is something that's basically been agreed by people across the political spectrum for a long time, there is a necessity for putting the role of the court and the balance between the branches of government on a sounder legal footing. There has always been a need for a certain amount of reform, but what the current government is doing, and why it's so unpopular in Israel, is because rather than trying to fix procedural problems, better define, the powers of the court, better sort of regulate how things are done, they're trying to essentially get rid of any judicial oversight of the government and the legislature, which would pretty much give untrammeled power to whatever parties are in the coalition at the time. Now, the issue is that Israel doesn't have a living constitution. Say what you will about any specific clause in any random country's constitution, the fact that they have one gives a firm legal basis. I think America has a really fine constitution that I'm very proud of, and it's always been a pain point for Israelis, many Israelis, that we don't have one like that. And the problem is that instead of a constitution, Israel has what are called Chokei Yesod, basic laws. Now, basic laws are, in original intent, laws that set down the basics of how government functions. The problem is that they don't have any, traditionally in the past, didn't have any specific constitutional status. They're passed in the same way as regular laws. There's nothing in the laws that's basically saying that these are special. And in the 1990s, the High Court of Justice essentially said, we're going to treat them as constitutional, as the basis of a future constitution, and we can invalidate legislation based on these laws. Now, in practice, it's a good thing, many people think. And it created a system whereby there is judicial review, which is necessary in any democratic country. The problem is that there's no real legal basis. So many people have argued over the years that it's necessary to better define what a basic law is, to increase the number of people, lawmakers necessary to vote to institute or change one, and to take the system and put it on, as I said, a firmer legal basis. That's something that's not very controversial, but that's not what the government's doing. The government's essentially saying, we want to do whatever we want to do, and we don't want to have any oversight from the judiciary. And that worries people. Over about 66% of Israelis in recent polls said that they're against the overhaul. That includes more than 40% of voters for the Likud party. Most of the business leaders in Israel and economists have been against it. The labor unions are against it. The heads of the major corporations and banks are against it. The head of the Bank of Israel has warned it'll devastate the economy. And it has led to some of the biggest social fractures in Israel that we've seen in decades. And I think we sort of reached that point where you can't keep kicking the can down the road and say, okay, we'll push off dealing with issues till later. It's bringing things to a head. And unless you can really have a firm legal basis for what's going on, you open yourself up to the type of demagoguery that we've seen from Netanyahu's allies. And that's sort of where we stand now. Now, Netanyahu has indicated that the override clause, the clause that would allow the Knesset to override a veto from the Supreme Court, is off the table for now, but that still leaves other provisions which would gut the power of the court. Now, the worry among many Israelis is this would send Israel down the road of a liberal democracy that Poland and Hungary have gone. And in fact, one senior Polish official, I don't know if this is true, and it's not something that's been acknowledged on the Israeli side, but one senior Polish official recently went on Polish television and said, we've been advising the Israelis on how to do things. So, if true, a little bit scary. a little bit scary. So what's gonna happen in the current session of the Knesset? Well, first of all, it depends on how the negotiations go, and the negotiations between the coalition and the opposition that are being brokered by President Herzog are going nowhere. But there's another issue going on right now that sort of threatens to make this whole thing moot, to just push everything aside. That's the fact that the ultra-Orthodox parties, the Haredim, are demanding a new law be passed exempting them from military service and allowing them to start at the moment you have to be in yeshiva until 26 to get an exemption from the army. And if you leave the yeshiva, let's say to work, you get drafted. So they want to make the age where they can leave the yeshiva 21. Now, they're demanding that the government pass this now, in the next few weeks immediately, or they won't vote for the budget. Now, the problem is, if the budget fails to pass, Israel goes to new elections. And the Haredim have basically said, if this government can't give us this, it doesn't deserve to exist. So, in a way, the entire judicial thing, the problem will still be there if the government collapses. And it'll be something that we have to deal with so that we don't get back to the same situation we're in now. But it might be moot, because the ultra-Orthodox parties have the power to bring down the government. Now, you have to remember, in 2019, the reason why we entered this cycle of election after election after election, which has been very annoying, that when the last election was announced, we had a correspondent come into the newsroom and yell, "I'm not doing this anymore, you can't make me, no, 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 no." Now, I very much sympathize. At this point, I want to, if I could find a cave in the Negev that had Wi-Fi and carpeting, I would move into a cave for a few years. But, what happened in 2019 is Avigdor Lieberman, who leads the secularist Sokol party and the ultra-Orthodox parties, were unable to agree on how to address the issue of the draft. The coalition they were trying to put together failed, and we had a cycle of elections that have led us to where we are now. So it's very possible that Haredim have been willing to do this before, and they could be willing to do it again. So things will get interesting. And so if you want to join me in my cave in the Negev, I'm sure I can find space.
So I think we have time for maybe a few more questions, and we have one from Stan Lambert, who's going back to the first topic for the most part. How much non-government, real-time, and uncontaminated information reaches the citizens, including Jews in Russia?
Well, I think that largely depends on, on economic status, education, and age. Younger people are much more likely to know how to use a VPN and to rely on outside media sources. People who are better educated or wealthier have access to different sources of information. But people who are older, who grew up in the Soviet system, who are getting their news from television, they're getting a steady barrage of propaganda. Now, how much people believe or don't believe, the issue of opinion polling in Russia is very fraught, because even when independent pollsters, and there's still the Levada Center, but even if you have an independent pollster doing a poll, people are nervous to say what they really think. They might say what they think the regime wants them to hear. So we don't know 100% what people believe or what people think. But we do know what their media diet is. And their media diet is 100% insane all of the time. You have news presenters threatening nuclear war against the West. You have crazy conspiracy theories. You have bluster and threats and calls for eradication of the Ukrainian nation. If you watch Russian television, it's wacky and not in a good way.
Any additional questions?
I'll answer one.
All right, we'll give Julian the final question.
I'll let you speculate beyond all possible reason, which is, imagine the Haredim do break the coalition. What will happen in the subsequent election?
Well, that doesn't actually require so much speculation, because we can see the polls. And the polls have been uniformly negative for Netanyahu. Even Channel 14, which is the pro-Netanyahu channel, which has been described by some people as the Fox News of Israel. And you would think their polling shows Netanyahu losing significant support, while Netanyahu's base is very supportive, and while many people in Likud are very supportive, the truth is that most of the general population has been turned off by what's going on. They don't like it. They don't like the fact that this is the most right-wing coalition we've seen. Look, I'm a pretty conservative right-wing guy, but some of the people in this coalition scare me. Look, more than 30 years ago, Yitzhak Shamir put Meir Kahane in administrative detention, which is essentially an emergency measure left over from pre-state Israel, from the mandatory period, where someone's a security threat, you detain them without a trial. And Kahane was put by a Likud leader in administrative detention for a period, and Likud was responsible for getting the Kahanists out of the Knesset. Now, decades later, we see the heirs of Kahane being brought back into the Knesset by the Likud. This is not your father's Likud. This is not the traditional Israeli right. And I think that's pushing a lot of people to other right-wing parties and centrist parties that are not part of the coalition. So people like Sar, who used to be in Likud, who's now in the opposition. You have Iyar Lapid, a lot of support is coming to Benny Gantz. If a new election was held today, you might get a coalition that looks a lot more like what we had under Bennett and Lapid. And the thing with Bennett and Lapid was, yeah, there were fundamental issues regarding the conflict, regarding Haredim, regarding all sorts of things that were never going to get resolved under a government that included both the far left and pro-settlement hardcore nationalists and an Arab party and a whole mix of everyone. But on the other hand, it was a party that governed, and it was a party that managed to keep things stable for a while. And I think we might go back to something like that at the elections tomorrow.
Great. So please join me in thanking Stan Sokol. Really grateful for your time. In addition to being a superb presenter, he's really a wonderful reporter. So if you don't have a subscription to Haaretz, it's worth the price of admission. Supporting good journalism, and I read Sam's articles frequently. I also want to encourage you to check out the many things happening at Beth Am's synagogue. You can go to your recent email or to our website. There's a lot happening at the shul. I want to highlight just two things that are coming up in the, what's that? And tomorrow, wait, what's tomorrow? Oh, lots and learn. Yes, thank you, Bonnie. So tomorrow, I wasn't going to highlight that, but I will now. We have the final installment of what's been a really wonderful series called Locks and Learn. Tomorrow will be at noon. It's usually a breakfast thing. So we'll have lox at lunch. I don't know. I think it'll work. And a presentation from Professor Shira Robinson, I think, who's presenting. So we've had a range of perspectives on our theme this year of tzedek, and looking forward to continuing the conversation about Israel. I suspect you'll hear from Shira a different perspective than you've heard from Sam tonight. Additionally, we have the holiday of Shavuot that's coming up pretty soon, and we have a really exciting, in addition to the second day of Yom Tov when we have Yizkor, we also have a program this year. We're going to do a different sort of Tikkun Leil Shavuot. We're going to talk about the Torah of Reservoir Hill and learning from institutional partners and neighbors here in the community, talking about their experiences, including Ray Kelly, a community organizer, who's done really important work around police reform, and presentations from Afghan refugee neighbors, and so on and so forth. And finally,
and cheesecake.
And cheesecake, of course, because it's Shavuot. And finally, on May 22nd at 7 p.m., that'll be a Monday night right after the Shabbaton. Who's going on the Shabbaton? Okay. Medina's going to Shabbaton. There are 100 people going to Shabbaton, so you're just not here. That's okay, because we're a Cineplex, right?
121 people.
121 people going to Shabbaton, and not you. That's gonna be amazing. But right after the Shabbaton, another amazing program will be that Monday night. We're gonna be co-sponsoring an event with Southern Baptist Church and Bishop Dante Hickman, and we'll have best-selling author Jonathan Ike, who will be here in our sanctuary. He will be releasing just about a week before that event a brand new major biography of Dr. Martin Luther King. I've read the book, Tom's read the book. It's worth reading, there's some new information in there. He's gonna be on midday, I believe, as well. Is that right, Tom? That afternoon, so you can hear the interview with Tom on midday. You can come to Betham and meet the author, buy signed copies of the books. So I think that's going to be a wonderful event, and I hope that you will tell friends, colleagues, family members about that as well. Folks, we're really grateful that you came. Thanks to the folks on Zoom for bearing with us with the early technical stuff, and have a great evening.